Good evening and welcome to this meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee of BCP Council. My name is John Beasley. I'm Chairman of the Audit and Governance Committee. And with us this evening we have Vice Chairman Councillor Williams, together with Councillors Brooke, Brown, Butt, that's Daniel Butt, Fear, Filer, Phipps and Trent. And we have a number of other councillors who will be speaking on certain items. Moving straight to the agenda, could I ask Mr. Hanton if you could just run through the housekeeping arrangements for this meeting, please?
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, members. Could I ask you to please note that the meeting of the committee is being recorded by the council for live broadcast and will be published on the council website for a minimum of 6 months. To ensure that the meeting is managed effectively, please could everyone present follow the ground rules for speaking. Only speak when invited to by the chairman. Always turn on your video function when invited to speak. State your name before you speak if you have not been introduced by name. Please mute your microphones when you. If you would like to speak on an item, please do so by utilising the raise your hand feature in the bar at the top of the Teams window. The message bar should not be used unless you are raising a point of order or providing the wording for a motion. And please remember it's visible to all parties. If at any time you would like to speak again, please use the raise your hand function again. If there is a recommendation move that requires a formal vote, this will be undertaken by the Democratic Services Officer carrying out a roll call of members present and asking for a response of for, against or abstain. And finally, Chairman, could I ask members to please ensure that background noise is kept to a minimum and that mobile phones and other devices are turned off or switched to silent for the duration of the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hanton. Turning to the agenda, item 1, apologies. I think we're all present, so I take it there are no apologies. And item 2, substitute members, it follows that there are no substitute members. Item 3, Mr. Hanton, declarations of interest.
I've received no prior notice of declaration, Chairman, unless anyone's got any they'd like to add at this stage.
I don't see any hands raised, so I think you can record there are no declarations of interest for this meeting. 4 on the agenda, which is confirmation of the minutes of our meeting on the 21st of January 2021. Are members of the committee who were then present content that I sign these as a true record of the minutes of that meeting? I don't see anybody signalling otherwise, so I confirm the minutes of the meeting on the 21st of January 2021. Mr. Hanton, item 5, public issues.
There's been no public issues received, Chairman.
Thank you very much. So that takes us on to the first substantive item on the agenda, which is item 6, which is the council referral of motion on gender neutral language. Just to remind those present or those watching or listening to the meeting, the Audit and Governance Committee was asked by Council to consider the issues behind and within the motion, and those were duly considered by the Audit and Governance Constitution Working Group, who are bringing back their findings from that to our meeting this evening. I wonder, just by way of introduction, therefore, if I could ask Mr. Jones from Democratic Services just to run through the procedure from that meeting. And then after that, we will be taking a number of speakers in a particular order. We'll start with Councillor L.J. Evans, the mover of the motion, followed by Councillor Lewis, if present, and then after that we will be taking Councillor Bobby Dove, who is the lead member for Equalities, Then we'll be taking Councillor Mellor, the Leader of the Council, following Watson, who's the Council's Equalities Officer. And then after that, members will have the opportunity to ask questions, and we will then discuss the issues that it raises. So, Mr. Jones, could you introduce the item for us, please?
Thank you, Chairman and members. Good evening. And you've stolen my first couple of paragraphs, so I will try to be brief as I can. I appreciate you've got a very busy agenda. So as you said, the report's before you this evening because it was referred back from full council on the 5th of January when it was proposed and seconded. The motion as proposed is set out in the report under paragraph 1. I'm not intending to reread that fully. That's already in the report, but clearly happy to do so if members require that to be read out. It was referred to the committee via the Constitution Review Working Group. The Constitution Review Working Group met on the 25th of February. It hasn't made any recommendations to this committee, but it did identify some questions probably or queries that in terms of the formulation of this report. So following that meeting, I had a telephone conversation and email exchange with the proposer to clarify some of those issues, and the bullet points under paragraph 6 draw together some of the queries in relation to terms which should or should not be used, and in relation to the scope of what is meant by all reports and formal communications, both verbal and written. I have a correction to make, if I can just draw members' attention. I spotted it earlier this afternoon in paragraph 6, where I refer to the list of gender neutral terms not to be used. That should, of course, say gender specific terms not to be used. So apologies for that. So if you subject to that correction. I then identify in paragraph 7 to 9 in relation to the Constitution, just reminding members that you did previously consider and recommend to Council in relation to the use of the word chairman in the Constitution. You resolved, or Council resolved, to leave that unchanged, but leave the discretion for the person presiding at the meeting in terms of how they wish to be addressed. However, if Council was minded to reconsider that, I have just drawn together some figures from the Constitution in relation to terms that we use. So there are 166 references to chairman, vice chairman, or their derivatives, 14 instances of gender-specific pronouns and adjectives, and 14 other references, which could be considered as gender-specific terms, although they all relate to the use of job titles in the document. I have highlighted in the report as well just some of the wider corporate perspective, and that if this motion was approved, then there could be, and I stress could be, some consequences for line of business processes which may require some system changes. I have said they're not insurmountable, and indeed I think to be fair, the clarification from the proposer has indicated that there would be a transition period for any changes, and of course and again you may wish to ask the proposer as to whether or not changes that required expenditure, for instance, would be appropriate. My understanding is that wouldn't. It's not looking for expenditure on system changes, and I don't think that would be probably a major issue for the organisation. It would require, of course, corporate guidance, training and awareness to be delivered to staff and councillors to embed that new process, and that activity could probably be best led by the Equality Action Commission group. If the committee is minded to make a recommendation to council, that will actually sit alongside the motion at council, so the motion belongs to council to be determined. So any recommendations or comments you wish to make would be presented back to full council. That's it, Chairman. Thank you very much. Any questions if there are any, but I think you'll probably need to address those through to the proposer.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Jones. That's extremely helpful by way of introduction. So we'll take the speakers in the order that I set out a moment ago, commencing with Councillor Evans, who was the proposer of the motion at Council. Councillor Evans.
Thank you, Councillor Beasley, for giving me this opportunity to present the motion I brought to Council in January. By bringing this motion, I am proposing that BCP Council resolves to, firstly, remove male universals such as chairman from the constitution, policies and all written and verbal communications, and to replace them with gender-neutral terms such as chair. And secondly, to use gender-neutral language where an individual's sex or social gender are not relevant or not known. So why is this even important? Well, words matter. Language reflects and influences attitudes, behaviours and perceptions. The use of gender-neutral language is a way to avoid implying that one sex or social gender is the norm. This helps to reduce gender stereotyping, promote social change and achieve gender equality. I strongly believe BCP Council should be committed to supporting women and minority groups to take part in local politics. We need to appreciate that the use of male universals and other gendered language can give the impression that local government is only accessible to certain people by reinforcing unconscious bias. I think the Australian LGBTQ+ guide on this is really helpful, and it's important to highlight that no one will get the language 100% right 100% of the time for 100% of the people. The important thing is to keep trying, and if you make a mistake, just apologise and continue the conversation. I'd like to thank Richard Jones for doing such an amazing job in bringing these ideas together into a formal report and clarifying my intentions. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that committee members may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Evans. I'll now turn to your seconder, Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Chair. Well, why adopt a gender-neutral language? So the use of masculine and feminine words to cover people, regardless of gender or sex, is unnecessary, inaccurate, and tends to reinforce historic gender stereotypes. In other words, gender-neutral writing is about clarity, inclusion, and equality, and would help to prevent unconscious bias. And the civil service has had this policy since 2007, when legislation changed to writing in gender-neutral language. Many other councils, such as Southend, Harlow and Devon County Council, have already adopted the policy. And the present situation, where we have phrasing which indicates a male-only perspective, or that assumes heterosexual relationships and that people fit into traditional gender norms, can create an exclusive environment where people could feel unwelcome and excluded. Much language that is gender-based is not harmless. It helps subordinate women in social and political relations. One of the consequences of inequality is inequality in how a situation is perceived, when people who are privileged by the system, who benefit from structural inequality, are less likely to notice or be bothered by it. However, they are able to use their privilege to help others. Women still have fewer opportunities than men, and one way to improve this is through language. Words such as he, him, and his are commonly used to refer to all people, but actually exclude half the human population and perpetuate the idea that male is the norm and female the anomaly. They can be changed to they, them and theirs, and thus will be more inclusive. Similarly, with using chairman, policeman, fireman, etc., studies have shown that when words like man are used generically to refer to people, readers or listeners tend to picture men only, not a balance of men and women, let alone women only, and chair, police officer, firefighter would be preferred. Attitudes are changing gradually. Most young people expect gender-neutral language these days, and we don't want to risk alienating them. BPC Council is a place where anyone, regardless of their sex, social gender or marital status, can take up a position with decision-making responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Lewis. The next speaker is Councillor Dove, who is the Council's lead member for Equalities. Councillor Dove.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to the meeting this evening, Chairman. I've listened to Councillor Evans, and they raised some very valid points, which I wholeheartedly endorse and agree with. In this new BCP Council, no one group should be left behind, and we should endeavour to ensure that BCP Council promotes equality of opportunity right across the board. As you know, this motion was raised at Council on the 5th of January 2021, and that evening there were a sequence of events, including the recommendation from A&G following a piece of work they carried out regarding the meetings. In short, it was agreed that the individual's choice as to how they would like to be addressed, including the use of gender-specific terms, would be adopted. Later that evening, a motion was put forward in which the first line read, "The Council resolves to use gender-neutral language in all reports and formal communications, both verbal and written." And in practice, this would apply to all written and verbal communications produced or used in an official capacity, such as reports, policies, correspondence, newsletters, consultations, official records. So just to be clear, I absolutely endorse the proposer's desires to see a more equitable council, and discussions such as this tonight demonstrates our desires to be a more modern, inclusive and fair council. But it was clear during the debate on the evening itself, and this was echoed right across the virtual chamber from all parties. But during that same debate on the motion, the A&G recommendations was also referred to because people quoted it and said that whilst motion, there would still be that personal right to self-identify. And it's quoted that this is considerate and supportive of the trans community. I think this may well be misunderstood. The motion as it stands at the moment could be perceived to be too rigid in its application, given the inclusion of the word all, and it means that in practice, it may be found to be inflexible. This would remove that opportunity for self-identity or that personal choice of how an individual would like to be addressed. Removing this right of choice will have serious implications if you are a trans person. The wording of the motion doesn't recognise the huge incredible step a trans person will have taken to come out, and the wording of the motion doesn't recognise their request to be addressed by a particular gender. So by adopting this motion in full with its current wording, we could be creating barriers, objectifying people and restricting the use of pronouns. People's identity is important to them, and where a choice has been made, we cannot take that choice away from them. And neither can I think of a more inclusive or greater acceptance of our trans community by addressing that person by their chosen pronoun, especially if they were the chairman or the chairwoman of this council. One of the reasons for referring the motion to A&G was so that we could have this deeper discussion to ensure we retain the rights to a person's choice in a debate, which is not limited to just a series of 3-minute statements. Our residents deserve better than that. Our trans community deserve better than that. And this motion deserves greater consideration than that. So as I've said, I absolutely subscribe to the ethos and the principles that Councillor Evans is seeking to achieve, and I will support them in those endeavours. I just worry that the implementation of this motion in full will not achieve the ambitions that we all want to see. Chair, I do not wish to direct the work of this panel, but wonder, in light of my thoughts, if I could be so bold as to perhaps request that perhaps the panel could consider slight amendments by way of a recommendation, so as to still support the principles of gender-neutral language, but in a way that it can be applied in a pragmatic and flexible manner while still retaining the personal choice. We are committed to the advancement and continued progression of equality and outcomes for all of those who share protected and recognised characteristics, and I hope that Councillor Evans will assist us in working on this. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Dunn. Now I would invite Councillor Mellor, Leader of the Council. Councillor Mellor.
Thank you very much, Chair. And like Councillor Dove, I absolutely support the aims and ambitions of Councillor Evans. and I'd like to thank them for raising this important point so that it can be explored. And in turn to challenge us as a council to see whether we can further improve the equalities of opportunity for all of those who share protected characteristics, not only for those that work in BCP Council, but also for the thousands of people who live in, work in and visit the BCP area. I would like to speak with respect to the remit and scope of where we should see the gender neutral language applied. The motion suggested that gender neutral language is applied in the following manner. In verbal or written communication, the policy should apply to all written and verbal communication produced or used in an official capacity, reports, policies, correspondence, newsletters, consultations, official records, etc. If the motion is adopted in full without any amendments, this would lead to correspondence such as letters addressed to our residents with a prefix of MX as opposed to Mr, Mrs, Miss, etc. Alternatively, we could revert to adopt the use of first names in correspondence with residents, partner agencies, etc. I don't know about you, but informality is a right that has to be reserved, and I wouldn't want to see the use of first names which can be perceived to cross boundaries. Reports. Again, I worry that gender neutral language, without recognising sex or gender within these, could have a detrimental effect upon those very same people we are trying to protect and include in our decision making. For example, our response to child sexual exploitation and the Rotherham report, where the victims were young females. The consultation for sexual entertainment venues, where the workers in these venues are predominantly female. Reports involving children, for example, young ASD children, which absolutely needs to be gender specific because girls present very differently to boys. Our BCP response to the domestic violence strategy is another example of where we differentiate our approach and engagement based on gender. In this instance, we automatically think of female victims, but there is a real need to also recognise the prevalence of male victims who are often silent on this issue. And we will be seeing targeted communications around this area which will identify specific gender. If we have gender neutral reports, how can we be sure that we have adequate safeguards in place? We know that the impacts of our decision making affect our cohorts differently. How do we measure that and ensure that there is no disproportionality, or worse still, how do we ensure that our decision making meets specific needs and doesn't harm them further? What about our transformation programme as well, which absolutely needs to be gender aware? We have to ensure that reports and action plans and pieces of work prevent there from being any disproportionate cumulative effect on any one sex or gender. We know that more women work in HR. We know that more men work in IT. We know that about 2/3 of our workforce are women. But we know that we have a higher percentage of part-time employees who again are women. We know that we have a greater proportion of women who are carers. All of these factors need to be taken into consideration. As the leader of this council, I have commissioned specific pieces of work to get a baseline of where we are now, and will be asking for monitoring reports throughout the Smarter Structures programme to check that there is no one protected characteristic being more adversely affected than others. And for that, reports and records cannot be gender neutral. When looking at our workforce, I must point out that there are times when there is genuine occupation requirement that we advertise for a specific gender. The challenges above were all recognised in the Gender Neutral Language Guidelines and their report titled Gender Neutral Language in the European Parliament. This was a huge piece of work which ran across all 27 member states. The conclusion reads, and I'll quote, Chair, Parliament is committed to gender equality and non-discrimination on gender grounds. The use of gender-sensitive language is one of the ways of implementing this commitment. The many languages and cultures represented in Parliament mean that there is no one-size-fits-all option in this regard, but that appropriate solutions must be sought in each specific context, taking into account the relevant linguistic and cultural parameters. I would absolutely like to adopt the principles of a motion proposed by Councillor Evans, but I fear this one-size-fits-all approach will not meet the aims of the motion, but it could also prevent us from meeting our legal obligations of our public sector equality duty, employment law, Children's and Family Act legislation, and also in safeguarding the most vulnerable in our society, just as a starting point. I do feel that when that role is actually being carried out by a person, such as during a meeting, it's then up to that individual as to how they would like to be addressed, which therefore takes into account a person's right to be addressed as they would like. This is in line with the adoption of the A&G recommendation on the 5th of January 21. But I do see where gender neutral language could be adopted successfully, especially within the Constitution, where roles are referred to and described. I would also like to reassure Councillor Evans that we are reviewing and rewriting our training programme, and as such they can be assured that this will include the benefits of using gender neutral language in any training delivered by BCP Council. Chair, I appreciate the opportunity very much to address your committee, and thank you for your serious consideration of this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Mellor. And then our final speaker is Sam Johnson, who is the proper officer for the Council in terms of equalities. Mr. Johnson.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Chairman, for the opportunity to speak. Well, there's not really a lot I can add to it, but to say I absolutely agree with the reasons the proposal's been put forward, because it does promote equality. But at the same time, it's absolutely right what the leader has said, and Councillor Dove, in that in terms of its application and implementation on the ground can be problematic. There are terms, if we look at equality impact assessments, where we need to look at things specifically in terms of a protected characteristic if there's a disproportionate impact, in terms of some of the issues addressing particular groups. More importantly, it's not something that could be enforced, but that is reflected in the report by Richard Jones. And in that context, I think that Councillor Evans recognised that. She says sort of apologise and move on would be an appropriate way forward. And I think the mischief may be caused by the fact that all suggests that there's no room for manoeuvre if adopted as it is. And in that way, I'm thinking from an officer's point of view and its application on the ground, absolutely agree with the principles, but the audit and governance and also the proposal may want to consider if an amendment would be appropriate, because to achieve the objective, which I understand it has been put forward.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Johnson. I'm going to go to questions and comments from members of the committee next. And of course, the committee may or may not make recommendations to full council. However, the decision-making body on this motion will be full council. So anything that comes from audit and governance, since the matter was referred back to this committee, will be no more than recommendations, and it will then be for full council to decide the issue at its next meeting. Councillor Filer, I think you indicated to speak. Councillor Filer?
I did indeed, Chairman, but I've been thinking about this quite a lot, and perhaps I'd like to listen to some questions before I speak. If you could give me 2 or 3 of the questions and hear the answers before I actually speak.
Certainly. Councillor Trent.
Oh, the camera's gone on now. Yeah, I thought this was actually something fairly straightforward and non-prescriptive, but a couple of speakers have painted it as if it's something very prescriptive and you get tied in all sorts of knots, and I suspect I will hear all this will be really expensive to introduce. I think if the principle was adopted, albeit if there's a line that, you know, if people want to be addressed a certain way, then there's no problem in addressing someone how they want to be addressed. But the general principle has to be, I think, gender neutral. If you don't start from that principle, you get yourself into all sorts of knots, and then it does become a highly complicated thing. I think the principle is perfectly sound. It's one we should adopt. And, you know, people are generally sensible. You're not going to get people that are, you know, going to deliberately tie themselves up in knots because there's someone who they feel might need to be addressed in a slightly different way. But I do think that there is a danger that some people looking for a reason not to adopt the the policy will tie it up in knots, and I think that would be totally wrong. You know, I think, yes, you know, have a little bit of flexibility at the edge for individuals who want a certain manner of addressing, but I think our language should be simple, straightforward, gender neutral, and as has been said, you know, there may be specific reports or something like that when you want to identify genders and so on, when you're actually looking to see whether there are problems in the community that's affecting one gender more than another, or transgenders or something like that. And I can't see any problem in saying that in something which is basically based around gender neutral. You can state facts as they are. Personally, I think the motion is a very reasonable motion. It isn't over prescriptive, and I just hope members don't start to make it complicated when it's not complicated. So I would support it as it stands, or with a very minor amendment that just allows for, you know, a very what I would think is a very rare sort of difference of opinion in how someone wants to be addressed, but don't let's make a complicated thing out of something which is simple and straightforward, which is what this is, personally.
Councillor Filer, I think your hand went up again, and then followed by Councillor Brooke. Councillor Filer.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Well, in principle, I think this is absolutely right. The principles that we should be gender neutral, and certainly listening to both Councillor LJ and Councillor Lisa, you both mentioned in what you said, you actually mentioned the word female, both of you. So I wonder if we'd be allowed to even say the word female. It is. I just feel this is a bit too prescriptive. The principle, yes, nobody should feel nobody should feel in any way disadvantaged by the way that they're addressed at a meeting. And Councillor Trent makes a very good point, and he said that there should be no trouble, that it's not prescriptive, and I just think it is a bit. And much as we say there'll be trouble, if it's so prescriptive, what can happen is that wrongly someone else would jump in and make a complaint about it. It's going to be a difficult transition. Chairman, I sort of was thinking about this, and I have got an idea for a recommendation, if I might read it to you, which would completely accept all the principles that Councillor that have been recommended by Councillor LJ, which are absolutely admirable, but would take that little element of total prescriptiveness out. I mean, I don't know. I think Councillor Drumella mentioned letters. I don't know how you could write to me without calling me Mrs. or Miss or Ms. or I would hate to be Mooks, and I think most of us would be. I think that was perhaps going a little far. So what I propose, if with your permission, I could read to you is. It's a minor amendment, but I think it would make it just that more acceptable to everybody and easier to implement. And it can always be made stronger in the future if that's what people want. And I suggest that this council resolves to note that there is inconsistent use of gender terms in the BCP Council's constitution, policies and communications. That the council will resolve to eliminate discrimination and advance equality of opportunity, that the council will remove gender-specific determination when describing roles within BCP unless there's a genuine occupational requirement for them to remain. This is to include the review of the council constitution, policies and communications, and replace written references with gender-neutral terms such as the role of the chair. That we communicate these changes to all departments and members of staff within BCP Council, that we continue to use pronouns when the sex of an individual is known or when an express request has been made from an individual to be referred to by a specific gender. We note the council will note the adoption of the audit and governance recommendations at council on 5th of January, which stated that no change be made to current practice relating to the form of address for the person presiding at meetings, and that this be left as a matter of choice for each individual person presiding, and that democratic services should ascertain in each case the preference of individual councillors as they're appointed to the chair. I hope that would be acceptable to this committee, and I hope it doesn't water down too much the intention of Councillor LJ and Councillor Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Filer. Do you have a seconder for that recommendation?
Yes,
or that
Chair.
proposed recommendation?
Yes, Chair. I'd like to second that, Councillor Daniel Butts.
Thank you very much indeed. Do you wish to speak to that now, or can I take other speakers?
No.
You're on mute, Councillor Butt.
No, take speaker, sorry.
Thank you very much. And just to remind members of the committee, if you look at the recommendation for this committee on this item, it's for us to determine whether to make any recommendations to full council. That's the key element to this. We're neither obliged to or not to, but we do have a suggested recommendation from Councillor Filer. Councillor Brooke.
Fine, thank you, Chair. With your permission, I would like to ask a question, which I believe was something that you were wanting before the discussion actually started. So this is taking us back a little bit, really. I would like to know, not only from Councillor Evans and Lewis, but also from Councillors Dove and Mellor, whether they have actually spoken with other councils that have introduced this or similar policies and what difficulties they have actually encountered. I'm a little bit concerned that we're seeing potentially some contrived comments coming in that are going to damage the motion as is put. So if I could have some clarification on that as to whether other councils have found similar difficulties and restrictions, limitations to the policy, or whether they have found it quite easy to implement. And I am, of course, highly supportive of the principles.
Thank you, Councillor Brooke. Well, I'll take that question in the order that you presented it, but I'd be grateful if I could add the council's officer, proper officer, Mr. Johnson, at the end of it as well, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, so, my apologies, Chair. I did exclude Mr. Johnson, but that was unintentional. And note, I've used the word Mr.
Duly noted. So if I could take the speakers in the order that were presented, and the question is, have you actually communicated with other councils to find out those reactions? So Councillor Evans.
Thank you, Councillor Beasley. I believe Richard Jones has spoken to some of the other councils, such as Southend-on-Sea, but just because other councils haven't really fulfilled their policy and sorted this out, I don't think that's necessarily a reason that we shouldn't pursue this further. But perhaps Richard Jones would like to come in on that.
Councillor Lewis, did you have anything to add in terms of consultation with other councils?
I'm sorry, Chair. I can only really reiterate what Councillor Evans has said, because I've just heard that councils have taken it up, but I haven't actually communicated with them personally on their experiences, so no.
Thank you very much. Councillor Dove.
Thank you. I haven't spoken with anyone council, but I have been advised that various councils have adopted this differently. So Devon, for example, who was mentioned as an example, have used it where beneficial, and they certainly don't apply it in all cases, which is exactly what Councillor Mellor and I are proposing this evening. I do think it's worth mentioning, I'm sorry that you see that this is contrived. It's absolutely worth mentioning that I am trying to offer a solution and a pragmatic approach to this so that we can absolutely adopt the principles as suggested by Councillor Evans. This is meant to be helpful. What I would say, however, is we absolutely have to be aware that we cannot banish the use of pronouns. We will be discriminating against our trans community, and for that reason I would really like to see this adopted in principle, but in a way which we can make it practicable and work for all, and also fulfil our legal obligations.
Thank you. And Councillor Mellor?
Yeah, thank you. Response to that, Councillor Dove, but I'll put it across a little bit more strongly. I'm absolutely appalled at the use of the word contrived. I think if you listen to the depth of feeling and seriousness in both the presentations that Councillor Dove and I made, there's nothing contrived in there whatsoever. We've quite calmly and rationally and educatedly looked at where this motion actually is going to do exactly the job it's trying not to do. We've talked about what did I talk about? Child sexual exploitation, domestic violence, sex, entertainment venues, etc. All talked about in absolute seriousness, and nothing contrived in it whatsoever. We're trying to make this motion work, and at the moment it doesn't work at all. It does exactly the opposite of the job. So I would like, Councillor Britt to take that word contrived back, actually. In terms of the part of the question, because it wasn't just the only part of the question, who have you spoken to? I'm aware of practice in a number of authorities. And I even used in my submission, the European Parliament, they found it difficult and said it's not as simple as this motion puts it. So other than being frankly very disappointed with Councillor Brooke, I think I've answered the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson, do you have knowledge of other councils who've gone down this route?
Yes, I do. I've spoken with not just other councils, but looking at what's at Devon. I've also spoken to the Equality Lead in the Cabinet Office. I've also spoken to the Director for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in the NHS. And where I've found anybody that's got gender-specific language, it's never been directly specific. It's always got flexibility with it, and where it can be used, because sometimes people accept, I think it was said earlier, I can't remember who said it, but there can't be a one-size-fits-all, and the principles. But I think in terms of application standing, people have always said to me that they've always been able to move to particular gender-specific terms as and when appropriate to do so. So it hasn't been sort of hard and fast is what I want to say.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I think Councillor Evans mentioned that Mr. Jones had conversations. Were those the same conversations, Mr. Jones, as Mr. Johnson has had, or do you have something fresh that you could add?
Thank you, Chair. Just very quickly, it was with my counterpart actually at Southend. So I think I believe they passed a very similar motion to what was proposed for BCP. Now, I was seeking to find out whether they had policies and guidance documents that were produced. I think that wasn't fruitful, if I'm quite honest. So I think they've adopted it, and it's probably rolled out fairly informally, I think was the impression I got. They've certainly updated the Constitution, those formal elements of constitutional elements, but I couldn't find any details about the wider aspect.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jones. That's helpful. Councillor Brooke, did you want to come back? Your hand is up.
Yes, I did take it down and put it up again because I do wish to come back. I'd like to thank everyone for their clarifications and responses to my question. And if I have caused offence in any way to anyone by choice of words, I do apologise. But I think there is an issue there that has been raised, and I have a little more understanding now, and especially from the information that Mr. Johnson has supplied us with. So, as I say, I am totally supportive of the principles, but would just wonder exactly how we go forward in terms of implementation. Councillor Filer's comment and recommendation is extremely long, and I would really like to see that in writing before I make a decision as to whether to support it or not. But as I say, I would fully support the principles that are before us tonight.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Brooke. Councillor Filer, just one moment, if you wouldn't mind. Do you have that? Do you have your proposed recommendation in writing? And is it in a format that could be forwarded to members and indeed to the Democratic Services officers as well?
Yeah, I might need a bit of help with the IT. Can I send it in an email, or would you? I have it on a piece of paper. I clearly can't send that, but I've jotted it down on my on an email, and so I could forward that on if that would help.
Well, I was wondering whether Mr. Hampton or Mr. Jones, if they had it, could share their screens so that we could all see it at the same time. I don't know technically whether Mr. Hampton or Mr. Jones might want to say yes or no to that.
I think, Chairman, if we could have it either sent to myself or Bob, we could paste it into the comments box so you can all see it there and then have it read out.
I'd be happy with that. I'm not confident in pasting an email into the comments box myself. So if I might send it to Richard Jones, it'll take me a moment or two because I'm working on two machines, but I'll be happy to do that.
Okay.
Councillor Evans.
Thank you. Just to further add to Councillor Brooks' point, although I haven't discussed this with other councils, the Her Majesty's Government's Legal Department has produced a pretty comprehensive guide to gender neutral drafting. And I kind of think if it's good enough for them, it's probably going to be suitable for our purposes as well. So just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Brooke. You're on mute, Councillor Brooke.
Yeah, sorry, I've now taken my hand down. That was an old hand.
So back on the issue. So we're now in a position of waiting for that draft recommendation to come through to us.
Chairman, it's Vice Chair here. There's two people with their hands up.
Not on my screen, there isn't. Could you help me?
Yeah, Councillor Peer.
Thank you very much. Sorry, neither of you were up on here. Councillor Phipp.
Thank you. Yeah.
My apologies.
No problem. It's okay. I know this happens from time to time that hands don't appear when they. Okay, right. Well, I've got a few probably very basic questions, I think. Sorry about this, but I'd just like to know this proposal as it stands at the moment. I know we're waiting for the other one. I'm glad that's coming through in writing because I agree with Councillor Brooke. It was a bit long and I wanted to see it and I was going to mention that. But the proposal as it stands at the moment it means that all written communications would have to be gender neutral. And as Councillor Mellor has pointed out, there's newsletters, letters, and this council sends out so many letters to so many different people. So if we're not calling people Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. or Miss or whatever, what are we calling them? Is it then the MX, or, you know, do we say hi? We don't start it with anything, or we say hello or dear person or what? And I think, you know, we have to be sensible about how we go about this. And so my question is, what are we proposing to call people? That's the first thing. And then the second part of it, I think, is to remove, nouns which appear to assume that a person of a particular gender will do a particular job, that type of thing. But that means that, I suppose, within all our documentation of any sort, we'll have to avoid things that have got man in or something to do with gender or whatever. So a manhole is a person hole or something like that, or what happens to mankind, man-made, you know, manhood, things like this. I'm sorry, but you have to think about these things and what are the answers? And in fact, things like mankind is a word. It's not. It's part of the English language. Are we changing the English language? What are we doing here? I'm just trying to get down to the bones of this, because some of it doesn't seem to sort of add up. And I think what somebody said was it may be too rigid here in its application. That was the wording I heard and wrote down from part of the debate. And I think I may agree with that. There's one other question. So that's two questions. The other one is, I'd just like to know, have we been inundated with anything from residents asking for this? Or is this just something that's come forward, and why has it come forward? I'm just wondering if there's a lot out there asking for us to do this. And I think actually we are very, very even-handed in what we do. I don't think we're breaking any rules. Everything, to me, I didn't realise, let's put it like that there was a problem. So I think that's it really. And I do think this is supposed to be equal for everyone, which is what we want, of course. And I may not choose personally to be addressed in a gender neutral way. I may or may not. But if I'm not, or if a resident isn't, then why should they be when they don't want to be? And I think that point has also been made. But anyway, I think that's it really. I won't go on anymore and see if we can get an answer to a few of those questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Phipps. I don't want to prolong this to the extent of taking up the full time of the Audit and Governance Committee, because we do have a busy agenda this evening, other than this very important item. I think a number of those questions were rhetorical in any case, to be frank, and I'm sure that your points have been well made enough for people to understand the points that you were making. What I would say is, in order to help move this along, we've got, I think, one other speaker. Is it just Councillor Fear, Vice Chairman? It is just Councillor Fear. So I'm going to take him. If you look in the chat column, you'll see the proposed recommendation from Councillor Filer, which is seconded by Councillor Butt. And I remind you that we're not obliged to have a recommendation from Audit and Governance, but we can if we wish to. That is the one that's in front of us for debate. Perhaps if you can look at the one that's in the chat bar, I will then take brief comments, please. And then I think we're going to need to move to a vote as to whether that is the recommendation or not. And then we can keep the meeting moving forward. So, Councillor Fear.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I will be brief on this because I don't understand time, but I'd first just like to thank Councillor Evans for bringing this, first of all, to full council, and obviously it's here at Audit and Governance. It's obviously definitely an important issue. Also like to thank the lead member for equalities for going through this and making sure that every group is included in this. For example, making sure the trans community is included, and this motion can work for the leader of the council, who has an overarching view on this, looking at all different sorts of departments and documents, etc. So I think the work from that has been invaluable, and actually feeding into this as well has been very helpful in where we've got to. I've had a look at Councillor Filer's amendment, and I feel from the motion to the amendment, I feel there is definitely connection of working. I feel it knits together nicely. So I believe, I think the amendment will go hand in hand with this motion when it goes back to full council. So I will be supporting that, and also just the work from Richard Jones and Sam Johnson, I think has been invaluable for getting this motion to this point. So I think they definitely need thanks for that as well. So like I say, Chairman, this amendment neatly puts the motion together, and I will be supporting that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Fear. So all members of Audit and Governance no doubt can see this in the sidebar now. Members of Audit and Governance, I think, are the only ones who, at this stage, we need in this debate. and I'd invite anybody who'd like to speak on that to indicate now, please. Councillor Evans, you've indicated, but obviously not as a member of the committee. If you can tell us briefly your comment, please.
Yes, sorry, I was just wondering if I would have a chance to answer some of the points raised before we go to the vote.
If you can do so briefly. The intention really wasn't for this to be a debate between members of Audit and Governance and those who had asked to speak on the subject from outside of the committee, but certainly if you can be brief, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so what I'd like to do is actually address the points that Councillor Dove and Councillor Mellor made. Yes, I agree the motion as proposed didn't quite fulfil what I wanted it to do. I've tried to post an amendment, which is pretty much what I said in my introduction, to clarify the motion. And it's not saying we can't use gender neutral language. It's only when it's an individual's sex or gender is unknown or it's not relevant. And I presumed, perhaps wrongly, that after we'd passed the motion earlier on in the January meeting to say that all individuals had the right to be addressed as they so wished, that would carry through, and I didn't see this motion in any way negating that. And I think that was Councillor Dove's main concern. That was not my intention in any way. If someone wants to be addressed as chairman, that's absolutely down to them, and I completely respect that. So I don't know what's happened with the chat function and why that's come out so weirdly. I hope people can read it, but I'm just wondering if people would be happy with that, or perhaps Richard could share it in another way, because I can't get it any better, and that people would be happy with. Perfect. Max has put it in a more readable form. I do apologise. I don't know what happened there. Just to see if people would be happy with that as an amendment to my motion, rather than and be happy to recommend that to council. Thank you.
Yes, but I would ask you to bear in mind that you will have that opportunity at council. This is purely a recommendation from the body to which it was referred from council, and our recommendation may or may not be acceptable when it gets back to council. Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, partly around the proposed amendment from Councillor Filer. I'm glad we've got it in front of us now, actually, because it was difficult to sort of follow because it's quite long, quite a bit wordy there. I'm slightly concerned actually that the detail that's in Councillor Filer's proposal there could become slightly more prescriptive. And I think this is the difficulty when you sort of get into the detail of it. And what I must say, actually, I fully support the principle of the motion that's before us, and I thank Councillor Evans and Councillor Lewis for bringing it forward, because I fully support it. And what I'd liked was the simplicity and the clarity of it as well, that it just expressed the principle. It's just how we go ahead with the detail, and some of the concerns that have been raised earlier, obviously about certain council reports which, because of the subject matter they're dealing with, will have to deal with like sexual entertainment venues and those sorts of things. Will, by reason of what the reports are about, will inevitably sort of be talking about different genders in different ways because of the either the services or what's involved. I think it is important we have something like this because of the issue of unconscious bias, and although I don't think people are sort of contacting us to say the council needs to do this, but there are people that believe we do need to do it, because I think it's something that's unconscious, and that we do actually need to raise our consciousness about these issues and about the fact that it's there, that we need to address them. I do like is it a point 2 in Councillor Evans' slight amendment there about using gender neutral language where an individual's sex or social gender are not relevant or not known. I think that probably go towards addressing the issue around council reports, which actually are dealing with matters that have to be experienced differently for different genders. So yeah, I'm not keen on the amendment just because it's sort of just come before us, and I'd probably like to sort of sit and have a think and consider that a little bit more. I'm really fully supportive of the principle of the original motion that's before us, possibly with then Councillor Evans' slight amendments, slight additions there.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. Councillor Trent.
I find the earlier amendment to be very complicated. Thought that actually completely undoes what is the essence of a good motion and way forward, and that's simplicity understood. But Councillor Evans has put in a modified variant of the original motion, which takes on board comments made by Councillor Dove in particular about the flexibility that is needed, and it also takes on board, I think, what went to council in January from this committee, and I'm hoping that we actually come to some consensus on this. And I think the rewording from Councillor Evans, if other members read it, it's in a rather difficult to read sort of green against a highlighter. But I think if members looked at that and thought about some of the comments that were made earlier on, they would find that would be an acceptable way forward. Rather than get bogged down in something that is overcomplicated, you know, let's come to some kind of consensus on this, and let's kind of address the concerns, but move forward with something that's not overcomplicated. That's my own view.
Thank you, Councillor Trent. Well, it's a matter for members of this committee to decide what recommendation, if any, they wish to put forward. I just wondered, Councillor Filer, since you suggested a recommendation, where you'd like to go with your recommendation, and whether there's anything else here in the sidebar that leads you to want to amend it or change it in any way, or whether you just want to stick to what you've already proposed.
I did realise as I was reading it out, Chairman, that it is quite complicated and it was quite a lot to put before people. It looked good on paper, but actually it did overcomplicate things. I think the amendment that Councillor Evans has put seems, I need to ask her what she means, but she's got 3 points there, 1, 2 and 3, and with that I'm not sure whether that would become the main. What she's put seems to make sense, absolute sense. So removing male universal such as chairman from the constitution, policies and written and verbal communication, and this is within reports calling them chair, though people would retain the right to be called chairman or anything else they wanted to be called. Use gender neutral language where an individual's sex or social gender are not relevant or not known. So one assumes if someone's called Thomas Smith, we are allowed to assume that it might just be a man and address him as Mr. Smith. I think we're all used to not knowing whether someone's a miss or a missing and addressing us. I would hate to be myself addressed by dear Anne. I'd hate that from people I don't know. But that seems to be fine. And respecting an individual's right to be addressed is exactly that. And would that then become the whole motion, or is this just amendment to the original motion? I'm not quite clear.
Well, just for clarification, Councillor Filer, we're not here to amend the motion. That's a matter for council. We are here, and I emphasise this point again, we are here to determine whether or not we want to make a recommendation from the membership of Audit and Governance to take to council prior to it determining the motion that is going to council at its next meeting. Right, and there is a subtle difference in there, and I think what I've been hearing doesn't really qualify with that. So I appreciate that Councillor Evans has put something further into the sidebar, which, if you, as I read it, a repetition of her motion, but in slightly different words. What you've put forward is a recommendation from this committee to be considered, and that of itself is what we are here to determine or not. Okay, and that's really what we need to speak to, and that's what we need to determine. And those who are not on the committee who have already spoken have made their points. It isn't a competitive process. They've made their points for us to take into consideration a recommendation. So my question back to you, Councillor Filer, is the same as it was before. Are you still happy with what you have proposed as a recommendation for this committee to determine, or not, or do you wish to amend it in any way? And I think that's about as straightforward as I can make it.
I'm happy with what I wrote, and it is more wordy than what Councillor Evans wrote, but that will be something that we could debate at council. I mean, that's absolutely something. This is an audit and governance committee, and audit and governance reports are sometimes wordy and sometimes quite complicated. But I don't think anything I've suggested there goes against the principles of what we want, and I'd be happy to leave it as it is, as a recommendation to go forward to council, and then if it needs to be further amended, it will be at the council meeting where this recommendation comes forward.
And the recommendation that comes from this committee will be taken into consideration by members of the council, and they may or may not wish to support what's being said, and that's for council to determine. Councillor Trent, is that an old hand, or have you indicated again?
Yeah, I've indicated.
Councillor Trent, followed by Councillor Brooke. Yeah.
I would actually like to suggest that, as worded in the sidebar, albeit it's rewording by the proposer of the original motion, I think Councillor Filer indicates that it's acceptable. It is actually simpler than what is on the table, and personally I think that should be the position of the committee, irrespective of where it came from, because I think it takes on board what people have said and takes on board the concerns. So I would like to propose, if the other one isn't proceeded with, that what is in the sidebar is the position that we adopt as a committee and recommend to council, if that's what we're actually doing. You know, I think it is much clearer. It clarifies what the concerns that have been expressed are, and it does it in a lot less words. So I would propose that, if someone doesn't want to propose it alongside me, you know, make it cross-party, you know, if we can, sort of thing. You know, let's have something that unites us rather than something which is going to be divisive.
Thank you, Councillor Trent. Councillor Brooke.
Fine. Thank you, Chair. Reading through Councillor Filer's recommendation, it actually reads far more like a motion to full council rather than a recommendation about the principle. Should the council be accepting the principle of the motion that's actually been put before it? And my view is that we should be putting a very simple recommendation forward to council, that they accept the principles within the motion, which we've all agreed with, but actually it's the implementation which is a separate thing, and that the second part of the recommendation is that the council looks at exactly how that implementation should take place to ensure that the principles are embedded in the council's ethos. In other words, we're saying that we put the motion back to council on the basis that we all support the principles, but we still have to work out exactly how those principles are put into practice.
Thank you, Councillor Brooke. Vice Chairman?
I wasn't actually going to join in because we've debated this twice now on my committee. We could, of course, adopt the not make a recommendation, which would then probably suit everybody, I would have thought, and let council sort it out as an alternative. I see a lot of nods against that, but it seems to me we're going to be here until quite late if we don't come to a conclusion.
Well, I'm going to do my best to make sure that we stay here quite late, actually, Vice Chairman, but I will need the goodwill to achieve that. Councillor Brown, and then I think we'll do as I suggested, which is go to a vote on this. Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, contrary to the last comment, I definitely do think we do need to make a recommendation to council. You know, this is our opportunity to consider this and to feed in our views. And I mainly think I just want to come back to the reason for this is predominantly about unconscious bias. You know, I've got a friend of mine who's introduced me to the book Invisible Women, Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. And, you know, sections of that have really opened my eyes to sort of how just society and language and the world has impacted on women that as a man, you know, I haven't experienced that, and it just opens my eyes, and I'm grateful to Councillor Evans and Councillor Lewis, you know, for sort of opening my eyes more, because I think we all have to address the fact that we may not feel we're biased or prejudiced, but we do have unconscious bias and unconscious leanings because of the language that's used, because of society around us, because of media, etc. And we do need to do something to address that in whichever way we can as a council. And I think it's incumbent on us as the Audit and Governance Committee to actually make a recommendation to council having considered this. And I can see no better recommendation than the motion that's been put before us, slightly amended by Councillor Evans with to address those concerns that have been raised. And I think that's what we should put forward to a full council. And I think it's our opportunity to really have a say and make a difference in our own small way to this issue.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Brown. At the expense of repeating myself, though, I'm afraid it is a matter for this committee. It isn't a matter for the mover of the motion to propose an alternative recommendation, and that's absolutely clear to me as far as the authority of this committee is concerned. Disappointing as that comment may be to certain people, and I apologise for that. Councillor Trent, you've indicated again. I wanted to move forward with this because we've got a lot of other business to consider this evening. I think we've spent sufficient time on this already. Is it a very brief comment?
Yes, it is. I want to propose the modified wording that Councillor Evans supplied. I want to propose that as a member of this committee as our position on it. I would like to propose that. Hopefully someone will second it, and then we can move forward and sort it out. And to me, it reflects what I think most people have said.
Well, we've got a proposed recommendation already in front of us. Is what you're suggesting an amendment to that recommendation?
I think it's an alternative recommendation.
Is it an amendment to that recommendation?
I think the whole thing is an amendment. It takes on board what the other recommendation is. The other recommendation is so long that, you know, it's difficult to amend that without completely rewriting it. So, you know,
well, before I go,
it's a much simpler way forward.
Before I see whether or not you have a seconder, I'm going to revert to Mr. Jones for him to determine whether or not that is an amendment to the proposed recommendation. Mr. Jones.
Chairman, and your monitoring officer is obviously on the meeting as well, but an amendment is the identification of words to be added or removed or replaced which do not negate the original motion. So really, for this to be a valid amendment, Councillor Trent would need to be detailing what words are to be removed and which words to be added. In truth, that's quite complex on this. Probably the easier way to deal with this is to dispose of the original motion as it was moved. If that is succeeded, that is closed and that's voted in its entirety. If it's voted against, then Councillor Trent could move the alternative motion that he's suggested.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Jones. That's most helpful. I don't think I've seen any other speakers, and so I think our best route is to go to a vote on this, and then we can move on, because I do need to remind members we are only on item 6 on the agenda. It's clear that we're not going to do this by consensus, so I wonder, Mr. Hampton or Mr. Jones, whether you could conduct a ballot, please.
Yes, Chairman. Thank you, Bob Hampton here. I'll do that by reading out the members of the committee and asking you to vote for, against, or to abstain, and that's what we'll call the Councillor Feiler proposal as set out in the sidebar. So I'll read out the names of alphabetical order. Councillor Beasley.
For.
Councillor Brooke. Councillor Brooke, can you hear us?
Hello.
Councillor Brooke, we can hear you.
Yes, my Wi-Fi's gone down, so I've lost contact.
What?
I'm just trying to rejoin the meeting. As the internet is now, the Wi-Fi has now come back, I should be able to get into the meeting again. Right, I'm back in.
So, Councillor Brooke, I don't know if you missed what we're doing, but we're having a formal vote now on the Councillor Feiler proposal as typed in the sidebar, and asking members whether they're for, against, or abstaining.
Okay, I heard that.
So, are you for, or against, or abstaining on that?
I'm against.
Councillor Brown.
I'm against.
Councillor Butt.
For.
Councillor Fear.
For.
Councillor Feiler.
For.
Councillor Phipps.
For.
Councillor Trent.
Against.
And Councillor Williams.
For.
Chairman, that's 6 for and 3 against.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Hampton. That is carried, and the recommendation from Audit and Governance going forward to full council, which I shall have to present at its next meeting, is carried. Thank you very much indeed, members. It's very rare that we have a formal vote on Audit and Governance, I'm grateful for the way in which all members have conducted themselves. I'm also grateful to those councillors who've taken the time to come and present to us tonight. So thank you very much to Councillor Evans, Councillor Lewis, Councillor Dove, and indeed Councillor Mellor. Thank you very much indeed also to Mr. Johnson for the time that you've obviously spent on this in terms of background, as indeed I think Mr. Jones has as well. So it's taken up quite a lot of time from quite a lot of people. I just emphasise again, this is a recommendation from Audit and Governance, and it is a matter for full council to determine the motion itself. We are only reporting back a recommendation because that's what we were asked to do by council at its last meeting. So, members of Audit and Governance, we need to move on. There's a lot of business to cover, and I do hope that we can manage to get through it relatively swiftly. Item 7 on the agenda is the report of the Constitution Review Working Group to the Constitution, and I wonder whether the chairman of the working group, that's the vice chairman of this committee, Councillor Williams, could present the working group's recommendations, and perhaps we could do all of those together and then see whether there's consensus around some or all of them, rather than dealing with them separately to start with. Councillor Williams.
Thank you, Chairman. This report is obviously of the working group, and it brings together the recommendations arising from the constitutional review. The working group has agreed to undertake a comprehensive review of the Constitution and is working to a timetable to complete this exercise. This will include the matters raised by individual councillors in response of the committee. It's currently planned to complete this work over a series of meetings and bring forward a consolidated report in September 2021. This report brings forward a more time-sensitive matters or fall outside the comprehensive review scope. We tackled, first of all, Code of Conduct for Councillors, process for consideration of complaints. And I refer councillors to paragraph 4 to 8 of the report and appendix 1 on page 23 of the agenda. It's proposed that the arrangements for dealing with the allegations for breach of the Code of Conduct are amended to introduce a process for the monitoring officer to initially filter complaints where it's considered appropriate and to extend to a speedy resolution. The proposed process set out in Appendix 1 identifies these examples where such action may be appropriate. To clarify, this is not removing the role of the Standards Committee members in considering complaints against councillors. However, following feedback from the chairman of the Standards Committee and the monitoring officer, there have been occasions when a complaint has been delayed for consideration by members when it could have been resolved more expediently. Public statements to committees. The working group considered a suggestion that the maximum number of words permitted within a formal statement submitted by the public should be increased from the existing 100-word limit. It's recommended that the current 100-word limit on public statement be retained. That was after quite a long debate. Welfare payments to councillors. I refer to paragraph 11 to 13 of the report. There is no provision that allows for welfare payments, for example, sickness or maternity, to be paid to councillors. However, the council's Employee Assistance Programme, EAP, is a service available to councillors to provide support and recommend that this programme is promoted more widely for councillors. Then we looked at COVID-19 response period, Constitution Article 15. Working group reviewed Article 15 relating to the provisions put in place in response to COVID-19. The revised article is set out in Appendix 2 to the report, but summarise the proposed changes. These include revising references to COVID-19 interim period to response period, the inclusion of a new procedure rule and appendix for the operation of virtual meetings, the removal of the urgent decision-making provisions, and provisions to respond to changes in legislations for virtual meetings. The recommendations are also set out in paragraph 17. And lastly, councillor involvement through appeals committee in hearing appeals by staff against dismissal. the working group considered whether councillors' involvement in employee appeal hearings against dismissal should be reviewed. We heard from the Director of Organisational Development, who advised the existing arrangements responded to the rights of employees from the preceding councils, and that the work to harmonise staff terms and conditions was still underway. As a consequence, it was considered potentially premature to alter the arrangements of the appeal process and involvement of councillors until harmonisation work is complete. Members are asked to consider deferring this matter pending terms and conditions review. And that really sumarises our work so far.
Thank you very much indeed, Vice Chairman. Just before we work through those, I wonder, Ms Zeiss, as the Council's Monitoring Officer, Head of Law, whether you have any comments specifically you wanted to make that maybe are over and above what's already in the paper. Don't feel obliged, but if there are, I thought it was the right time to ask you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Just briefly to say that if anyone was alarmed by a mention of the removal of urgency decision proceedings, that was just because there is already a very clear provision for making urgent decisions in the body of the Constitution. And now that we are over the initial emergency section of COVID-19 and reverting more to business as usual in handling the pandemic, I felt that it wasn't necessary for us to have two urgent decision-making provisions within the Constitution, so that has just been rationalised into one. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Zeiss. And just to remind members, of course, the working group comprises 5 of the 9 members of Audit and Governance. So 5 members, myself included, have already been through these and come back with the recommendations that you have before you this evening. So if I could take any comments, and then we can see whether we can agree what is in the proposal. Councillor Filer.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a question that I would like to ask, please, of Susan Zeiss, and that's about the appeals. I'm not sure about this at all. And I was a member of the Appeals Committee on one of the preceding councils, and I'm on it now again. And I've noticed that in the future we're going to be getting some appeals against redundancies, which is completely new. It was certainly not in the preceding councils. And has that been looked at? And it sort of seems, I understand a dismissal appeal where you would feel the employee has a right to have their case heard, but a redundancy appeal, I'd have thought redundancies are something for the officers to decide, not for members to decide. So could you just answer that one?
Ms Zeiss, would you like to answer?
Chairman, through you, thank you. Well, I think various councils approach this in various ways, Councillor Filer. And yes, it's been my experience as well, where the balance between those appeals that members get involved in and those that are strictly dealt with in the operational side of the business is different from the balance at this particular authority. So there is a range on which you can choose. I would agree personally that it would be better to have councillors involved in the more serious ones and not potentially in the more routine redundancy through a major transformation program. But that is just my personal view. That's not as it stands at the moment.
Thank you very much. I don't think anybody else is. Oh, Vice Chairman.
Yeah, very remiss of me. I just wanted to thank the members of the committee, in no particular order, Councillor Brooke, Councillor Butt, Councillor Trent and your good self for the work that you're doing, and also the officers, Susan Zeiss and Richard Jones, and of course Mr Hampton for their input too. That's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Appreciated, Vice Chairman, appreciated. So could I see whether any members of the committee would not be supportive of the recommendations coming forward, which are in the paper and which the Chairman of the Working Group has outlined to us this evening? I think there's nobody's indicated, and under the protocol explained at the beginning of the meeting, I think all of those recommendations have been accepted by the committee. So thank you very much indeed. I'm grateful for that. We will be having a number of further working group meetings, and we will have as a fairly regular feature on audit and governance agendas work coming forward from those meetings. And I think it's outlined that the Constitution review should be completed by, I think it's September. So, you know, there is a lot more yet to be done, together with, of course, all of those issues which members of the council have asked us to look at as well. So it seems most the most efficient way of dealing with it is to do them meeting by meeting, bring them forward, rather than it becoming so many items that it's hard for members of the council to follow. So thank you for the work you've already done on the working group. There's far more to come yet, I suspect. Moving on now to item 8 on the agenda, which is the annual evolution of the anti-fraud and corruption policy, the whistleblower policy, and declarations of interest, gifts and hospitality policy. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Councillor Beasley. Good evening, everyone. With your agreement, Councillor Beasley, I'll keep my camera off because I'm having internet problems, so apologies for that. At the first meeting of BCP Council's Audit and Governance Committee back in 2019, we agreed that for the key policies that this committee has oversight of, they would be subject to a business as usual annual evolutionary approach to align with the financial year start and end date. We also agreed that we would show any changes in red text throughout the documents, including in the live document, so practitioners could see exactly where Audit and Governance had agreed any changes. The rationale for all of this, of course, is, you know, good governance rhythm, policies remain updated, fit for purpose, and they don't wither on the vine, so to speak. The evolutionary changes this year are relatively modest and are limited to some contact detail changes and some very minor wording changes to align with best practice or legislative updates. That said, I just want to highlight a couple of key things for you. First of all, the whistleblowing policy on page 43 of your pack at 1.4, we're introducing a concept called prescribed person. This is where the council could be contacted on specific areas such as health and safety matters, consumer protection matters, or food standards matters, and the council has to apply the principles of the whistleblowing policy, accepting that it cannot necessarily protect a worker from another entity in quite the way it can for its own employees. Nevertheless, we can apply the principles, and the most obvious one of that is to keep the whistleblower's identity confidential. We've also added 2 letter templates on page 54 and 55 of your agenda pack to the whistleblowing policy, and that's to help consistent application of the policy going forward. And finally, very quickly, on the third policy tonight, the Declaration of Interest, Gifts and Hospitality, you'll be reminded that currently the policy says that all Tier 4 officers and above are required to make a positive declaration, and that includes a nil declaration. What we're proposing is to add a requirement for officers below Tier 4 who use their discretion to make either eligibility decisions, award decisions, or grant permission decisions to also have to make a positive declaration, including a nil declaration if that's necessary. And I think that enhances the openness and transparency and allows the council to, if it's challenged, to evidence very clearly that officers who make decisions have considered the policy and have made declarations where appropriate. I'll close there, Councillor Beasley. Thank you, and ask if any members have got any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Stannard. Councillor Brooke.
Fine, thank you, Chair. I've just got some minor points. I don't have any quibbles at all with the items in red, but I would like to draw your attention to page 48 and of our documents, page 7 of the whistleblowing, paragraph 6.2. There is reference there in a series of stages, and stage 3 refers to initial response to a formal discussion. When you go to page 52 of our report and 11 of the policy, you will find it's in an appendix that it's actually outlining or giving in far more detail the various stages, and stage 3 is highlighted as the initial response to a formal disclosure. Would it not be sensible to ensure that the page 48 heading and stage 3 is also formal disclosure rather than formal discussion?
I will make that change, Councillor Brooke. I agree with you.
Fine,
And
thank you.
I will use the disclosure term as per the appendix, because I think that's more appropriate.
I thought that was the one to use. And then, if I may, on page 54, which is one of the template letters, if I just turn to it, in the second paragraph, it reads, firstly, thank you for raising concerns. It is the important for employees. I think the word the actually needs to be removed.
I agree, that will be done.
And on page 55, which is the other template letter, I believe in the partway down it starts, I trust you feel that, and then it goes on, has been dealt with satisfactorily. I believe that should possibly be it or some other word.
I agree, that will also be changed.
Right. Sorry to have done my school teacher proofreading approach there, but it does at least show I've read the documents.
Thank you for raising them. I apologise. No matter how many times you proofread these things, sometimes a couple of things slip through, and I apologise.
Yeah, they're only minor, but I spotted them today, and it was really a bit too late to sort of deal with them by email.
No problem at all.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Brooke, for being so sharp-eyed. It's greatly appreciated, and as thorough as I would always expect from you. Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, and thank you to Nigel for presenting this report. Yeah, when I look through I don't really have any issue with the contents of the policy, and I think the policies are good, are sound, and are useful, and the amendments and sort of annual adjustments are useful. My main concern is around the sort of the awareness, potentially around anti-fraud and corruption policy, and the sort of training and awareness and embedding of those sorts that policy within officers across, we're now such a large organisation, having brought the 3 councils together. I'm really conscious that we need officers at all levels in all sorts of roles to be continually aware of these sorts of risks, whether it would just be spending, procuring goods and spending money, or all the facets of fraud and corruption. And I know in the report it talks about fraud awareness and mandatory fraud awareness training for all employees. I'd just like to ask, it's obviously an e-learning thing, is that an annual sort of e-learning project that staff have to do, or is it just a one-off as part of induction? And how do we go about making sure that this is continually communicated and continually in people's minds, so that they know when they need to be thinking about escalating a concern?
Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. You're right. It is mandatory training. What we try to do as a council is that mandatory training is aspirationally tried to be updated every 3 years. So it's not an annual refresh, but it tends to be the case that we refresh the training modules with new legislative requirements every 3 years, and therefore that's the frequency at which we aspire to have staff trained to. It is fair to say that we are currently working on the take up of mandatory training. It's one of the council's areas we're looking at across the board, not just for fraud training, but the other 8, 9. There's 9, currently 9. There will soon be 13 mandatory training programs that the council will adopt, and we'll have processes in place, including internal audit activity to ensure compliance with those mandatory training policies.
I've had nobody else indicate questions, so thank you very much indeed for that, Mr. Stannard. Extremely thorough, and again, thank you, Councillor Brooke, for your sharp-eyed amendments. I'm grateful to you. Could we move to the recommendations? We have 2. The first is to approve the council's whistleblowing policy, anti-fraud and corruption policy. And the second is to endorse the declaration of interest, gifts and hospitality policy before formal approval by the Corporate Management Board. Can we all support those 2 recommendations? If anybody to the contrary, please indicate. No, so those recommendations are agreed. That moves us on to item 9 on the agenda, financial regulations, annual evolution for the financial year 2021-22. And that again is Nigel Stannard, who's the Head of Audit and Management Assurance. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chairman. I don't know what this says about me, but this is my favourite business as usual job of the year, evolving financial regs. So yeah, it's right up my street, this one. It's the same principle as the previous paper. Changes are shown in red text throughout the document. And there are 3 things that I really want to highlight to committee tonight. The first one is what we haven't done, so that there are no changes in most of the sections to financial regs. However, there are several minor editing changes in Part G and in the glossary and acronyms section around the resulting from the UK transition from the European Union. So what we've done is any mention to specific EU legislation has been replaced by equivalent UK legislation. Just to be clear that in practice, there's no changes to the requirements as a result of those legislation changes. And to illustrate the point, most materially, all procurement thresholds have stayed exactly the same. However, it's worth pointing out that that could change in this year. So the UK government is looking at its procurement policies nationally, and there is a chance that some of those thresholds may change in year, which we'll keep abreast of, and change the financial regs in year accordingly if that needs to happen. I've also more fundamentally changed Part G, and it's shown in red throughout the document, so it looks a major change. However, in practice, what we've done is we've quite radically reordered and renumbered the content, but actual fact the words are broadly similar. The reordering has been necessary to try and align more appropriately with a typical procurement cycle. And that's been at the request of some practicing officers who felt that the ordering was slightly awry in the current version. We've also introduced a few more tables to replace simple words. Sometimes it's easier to read things in tables than in plain text. And the most material change is that paragraph 39 in Part G. If I could just draw your attention to that, it's on page 156 of the agenda pack and page 41 of the financial regs. And what the table does, it introduces a concept of procurement decision records, which we've promoted, so to speak, from the current guidance and guidance that the procurement team keep together to accompany the financial regs. And the reason we've promoted them is in response to two quite high profile recent cases in the national press, where a council in England and a government department have failed to demonstrate how they made procurement decisions and how they arrived at them. And in the case of the council, that has cost that council £1.6 million. So we felt better safe than sorry, although this council was already doing those procurement decision records. We strengthened and given a bit more gravitas to their requirements by adding them to the table on page paragraph 39, as I say. Happy to take any questions, Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Stannard. Members, have you any questions? Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Not particularly a question. I like the fact that Mr. Stannard said he enjoys doing this each year. I've been reading his financial regulations for more years than I care to remember, and I quite enjoy sort of looking at the annual tweaks and amendments. And I'm content. I was a bit concerned with the amount of red in section G, but from the explanation there, you know, I can understand that that's really sort of reordering things. So yeah, I'd just like to thank Mr. Stannard for his efforts and his attention to detail in maintaining these up-to-date financial regulations and keeping them compliant and keeping them user-friendly. I think we had a big improvement in a couple of years ago when they became much more sort of user-friendly and able for people to sort of understand and engage with the use of the tables, etc. So yeah, no particular questions or comments, but just thank the officer.
And I'm sure that all members of the committee would be more than happy to endorse those comments, Councillor Brown. They're well made. Thank you. So moving to the recommendation, which is that the financial regulations as shown in Appendix A be approved and referred to Council for adoption. I take it that all members will be supportive of that recommendation. If any aren't, please indicate. No. In that case, I shall take that forward at next Council as the recommendation from the Audit and Governance Committee. Moving on to item 10 on the agenda, the amended 2019-20 financial statements and updated audit findings report. This will be introduced by Dan Povey, who I think is going to give, and then Paul Dossett from our external auditors, Grant Thornton, will follow through, particularly referencing the appendix. And as ever, to Mr. Povey, Mr. Dossett, and for the following item, Ms. Harding from Grant Thornton, thank you very much indeed for staying the course. And as ever, sorry that you're at the end of the agenda, but no less important for that. So, Mr. Povey, would you like to start this item off, please?
Thank you very much, Chairman. Yes, so the previous two meetings of the Audit and Governance committee approved the draft statement of accounts and also considered the interim audit finding reports. But I'm very pleased to say that the audit of the 2019-20 financial statements is now complete, and so this item presents what are the final set of accounts and the final audit finding reports for consideration and approval by this committee, along with the associated signing of the relevant legal documents. In terms of the headlines, just keeping it at a high level, Chairman, as previously reported to the last meeting, the opinions will be unqualified opinion on the statement of accounts and a qualified except for opinion on the value for money conclusion. Since the consideration of the draft accounts, there have been some material adjustments to the balance sheet and income and expenditure account, but none of them actually affect the financial position of the council. They're all sort of accounting adjustments. The outturn that we reported to Cabinet in July of a surplus of 0.2 million still stands, and so while some of the adjustments, the figures are quite big, they don't actually affect the financial standing of the council or the outturn. Paragraph 14 summarises for the committee what some of the larger changes are to the balance sheet. Generally, changes to the value of council dwellings and property, plant and equipment due to either errors or corrections with floor areas or treatment of capital expenditure. Members of the committee will see in paragraph 15, one of the comments of the auditor in their report is that the valuation processes are improving for BCP Council compared to some of the legacy arrangements, but there is still some more we can do to oil the wheels and make a better process for next year. And you'll see in paragraph 15 of the covering report that is very much being taken in hand by management. We've got a single valuer for the property, plant and equipment assets for next year. We've already had an engagement meeting with them and with Grant Thornton to set out the requirements in terms of evidence and the various things that they need to do to prove the valuations. And we have already reviewed the assets which need updated floor plans, are in the process of completing that work. Paragraph 16, Chairman, just details some of the changes to the income and expenditure account. They are as reported to the January committee. There were no further material amendments to the I&E account. And again, they didn't change the bottom line. They were really accounting adjustments. I will leave it there in terms of a high level presentation, Chairman, and hand over to my colleagues at Grant Thornton.
Thank you, Dan. Sam will take us through the highlights of the report. I mean, obviously we have presented a version of this a couple of times, so we'll keep it to the changes and the big picture, and then we're happy to take any questions members have.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So this is our third iteration of our audit findings report. I'd probably like to draw your attention to page 43 to 47, which sets out our the final amendments that we've made to the financial statements as a result of the audit process. As a result of those, we have identified a number of control weaknesses. Some of those were picked up in Mr. Povey's part of the presentation, and also management's responses to those are set out within that. I think, as Mr. Povey has said, the majority of the issues that we found have related to the valuation of land and buildings, probably requiring a greater degree of oversight and review of the valuation process. But we've had a lot of discussions with management around the processes that are going to put in place, so we're confident that should improve going forward. I think the underlying complexity of the financial systems resulting from the merger, so a number of sort of the systems require sort of 3 different iterations, so 3 collection funds and things like that, have also sort of added to the complexity of both preparing the financial statements but also of the audit process. I wasn't planning on going through the report in any great detail, but I'm happy to take any questions on the findings that are within there. I think the final thing that I would probably like to say is Paul and I intend to sort of finalise the file and issue the opinion tomorrow. However, at this stage, we won't be able to certify the audit closed because we still have to do the whole of government accounts return, which I understand the council will be submitting within the next day or so. And then obviously we need to spend a few days doing our audit procedures because you are for the first time above the threshold of 500 million. So we do need to do some additional procedures to certify that before we can sign off the audit as closed. But hopefully that will happen in the next week or two.
So members, have you any questions, please? There do not appear to be any. So could I thank Mr. Povey, Mr. Dossett and Ms. Harding very much indeed for the work that you've undertaken, which is appreciated, and obviously the thoroughness with which you've discharged those duties. And I think the issues that you have raised have been well and truly noted. I'm personally pleased, particularly from hearing it back from Mr. Povey, that they are all in hand, and I'm sure that when we're here in a year's time, that they will have been addressed in the way that he's set out. So could we move on then to the 4 recommendations, which I will read out. So A, Audit and Governance Committee notes the anticipated audit opinions and audit findings of the Council's external auditor included at Appendix A to this report. B, approves the 2019-20 financial statements included at Appendix B. C, authorises the chair of this committee and the Section 151 officer to sign the letter of representation included at Appendix C and the statement of responsibilities at Appendix D. And finally, at D, approves the treatment of the unadjusted misstatement at Appendix E. I noted that Mr. Richards was on the line just now, so in terms of the 3rd recommendation, which requires his signature as well as mine, he is a party to this decision-making process, and I think in proper governance terms that's exactly as it should be. So members, those are the 4 recommendations. I will assume from the lack of questions that you are all supportive of those recommendations. If anybody is not, please could you indicate? No, so those recommendations are approved by the Audit and Governance Committee. Moving on now to item 11 on the agenda, External Auditor's Certificate of Claims and Returns 2019-20, and I understand that Ms. Harding from Grant Thornton, as our external auditors, is going to be introducing this item. Ms. Harding.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, this is a verbal update, really, just to let the committee know the status of the grants that we've certified as external auditors for 19-20. The first one is the housing benefit claim. That was certified in good time to meet the deadline for DWP. The total claim is 110 million, and out of that we did identify a small number of errors, but those would have resulted in an extrapolated finding of £2,000. So I think overall the council has done extremely well in preparing its housing benefit claim, and we have identified a reduction in the number of errors that we found across the legacy councils as well. So there's a very good direction of travel in respect of the housing benefit. We also certified the pooling capital receipts claim and the teachers' pensions claim. Both of those were also completed within the deadlines, and we only had 2 minor reporting matters within those. So we're happy to report that the 19-20 certification process is completed for all the council's claims to a satisfactory ending. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Harding. Members, have you any questions? No, there don't appear to be any questions, so thank you very much indeed for that verbal update, Ms. Harding, it's appreciated. Could we now move on to item 12 on the agenda, which is the Audit and Governance Forward Plan, which is on the cusp of the municipal year, as you will appreciate. There is only one meeting of this municipal year left within our forward plan. That's the one to be held on the 22nd of April. And within that, I would make one comment before passing over to Mr. Stannard. You will note that there is an item with regard to a review of BH Live and the contractual and governance arrangements. We've put that in and kept it in at the 22nd of April, but it's on the basis that the paper has already been to overview and scrutiny prior to coming to us. That was something we resolved when it came to us originally, and we are not sure yet whether or not overview and scrutiny will have dealt with it prior to the 22nd of April. So it is possible that item will need to move into the new municipal year and obviously the new forward plan. I just think that it's important that we do it in the order that we agreed, because really the governance issues are the ones that come up at the end of the process, and therefore we have to see the paper after everybody else. So, Mr. Stannard, could you just take us through the arrangements for the forward plan, any other items on the 22nd of April, and the setting of the forward plan for the municipal year 2021-22? Mr. Stannard.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I'll have my camera on and hope I don't drop out. Forgive me if I turn it off quickly. If I'm, as you've said, we're close to the municipal year end. So for the next committee on the 22nd of January, I'll be bringing forward the proposed full forward plan for the next next municipal year rather, and obviously a lot of our reports that we receive at this committee are annual reports, so it will look broadly similar and contain broadly similar reports. One thing to ask of the committee tonight, Chairman, with your agreement, is that myself and Susan Zeiss, the monitoring officer, we've been working on the council's RIFA policy, regulation of investigatory powers policy, and our work has gone a bit better than anticipated. So we're hoping with your agreement that we could bring forward that policy to the next committee on the 22nd of April, rather than the first one of the planned municipal year in the future. So that would, with your agreement, we can add that to the forward plan. But other than that, nothing else to say. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stannard. I hope we can agree that, because I think it's a piece of work that we would then have resolved in a more timely manner. Are we all agreed on bringing that item into the forward plan? Anybody dissent from that? No, that's excellent. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the work that you and other officers have done on the forward plan. Appreciate it, Mr. Stannard. That takes us, members, to the end of our agenda for this evening. Sorry, I've just seen a hand come up. Councillor Phipps.
Yeah, sorry, can I just ask, just looking at that next meeting, a hell of a lot of stuff on it. I think it's about 12 items. Do you think it's doable, or do you think there ought to be a meeting in between? That was all. But I mean, just go for it. But it does look a really, really packed agenda. That was all. And I think it's 12 items if you count them.
My comment, and then I'll pass over to Mr. Stannard, is that with the exception of the item that I raised earlier about BH Live, they're regular and routine items that come to us in, if you like, that regular quarterly meeting. So the way we construct it is quarterly meetings throughout the year, and then additional meetings for specific pieces of work. And so it does look a lot, and there'll be a lot of reading. That's the point. There's a lot of reading required, rather than necessarily a lot of debate and explanation. We should be all right, Councillor Phipps. It's hoped that we can do it within the 2 hours that I like to try to conduct these meetings.
Okay,
Mr. Stannard, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, thank you, Chairman. I think you hit the nail on the head with that explanation.
Thank you very much, and thank you for raising it, because anybody new to the committee might wonder that, quite rightly. But with goodwill, I should think we've managed to get there somehow. Thank you. So that brings us to the end of our agenda for this evening. Thank you very much indeed to the officers for all the work that went into the preparation of reports for this meeting, and also a thank you again to Mr. Dossett and Ms. Harding from Grant Thornton, our external auditors, for their contributions to the items that they were responsible for. And so I close this meeting, the Audit and Governance Committee, at 8:04 p.m. Thank you all very much indeed, and good night.